Kwekwe, hello, bonjour, and thank you foremost to the elders who got these meetings off in a good way today. I want to thank as well National Chief Roseanne Archibald and the chiefs and leaders for inviting me to speak here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Since I've become the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada and now Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, I've had to start far too many speeches by expressing condolences, and that isn't lost on me. I do want to express my sincere condolences to the family, friends, and loved ones of the recent victim who was uncovered at the Brady landfill this week. I know there's nothing that I can say that will relieve the pain of those who are affected and those who are re-traumatized by this horrific discovery. There's really nothing I can say, but there is something that we can do, and I want to be clear that we know and Canada knows that we need to do more. Every painful reminder adds to that. But every level of government, including ours, every province, territory, organization, institution, every individual person has a role to play and a responsibility in ending gender-based violence. Everyone deserves to feel safe and be safe, yet this is not the reality of far too many Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people in Canada. We need to do better for families, survivors, and communities living with the consequence of this ongoing national crisis. There's no easy or quick solution. The final report underscored that, but work is underway with over 25 departments and agencies across the Government of Canada that are actively responsible for implementing the federal government's pathway, its responsibility. And in accordance with Article 22 of the Declaration, we'll continue engaging with Indigenous partners all levels of government to ensure Indigenous women, children are fully protected from all forms of violence and discrimination. I want to take a brief moment as well to recognize AFN Women's Council for their extensive work on the Breathing Life into the Calls for Justice report, which recommended coordinated actions in the area of justice, human security, health and wellness, and culture and safety. The Breathing Life into the Calls report says that the system is too colonial. When you say you are trying to implement the calls for justice, there needs to be action at the end of that. I can't agree more. Action lies at the heart of achieving lasting and meaningful change. We need to take action on the short term to protect Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQIA+ people who aren't safe, continue to fear for their livelihoods, and we need to take action to influence long-term sustainable progress so generations of Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people across Canada can be safe and feel safe. Pour mettre fin à cette crise à long terme, nous devons nous attaquer aux causes systémiques. La complexité inhérente au changement des structures et des institutions fondamentales prend du temps, et certains d'autres nécessiteront une action soutenue au cours de plusieurs générations. Ce travail doit être mené par les familles et les survivants afin de s'assurer que nos efforts tiennent compte des traumatismes et soient culturellement adaptés. Leur expérience vécue apporteront des perspectives, des solutions et des directives indispensables pour un changement profond. Accountability and following the guidance of your peoples is critical, which is why we appointed Ms. Jennifer Moore-Rattray as the Ministerial Special Representative in January. Her engagement with survivors and families of Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQIA+ organizations has just begun, but it will ensure that Indigenous perspectives are guiding the path towards the MIWG Call for Justice 1.7, which is advocacy that AFN has put forward and many Indigenous groups have put forward, and it's thanks to that the investments that we've seen in the budget saw the light of day. I know this work has just begun, but I look forward to our recommendations. It doesn't mean we can take a break in the meantime. The implementations of the calls for justice require an entire government approach, which is why I committed to hosting a permanent national roundtable with Indigenous leaders and partners and federal, provincial, territorial governments on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse people. We look forward to hosting a second national roundtable in the fall of 2023 so that we can work together faster to accelerate the federal pathway and implement the calls to justice in order to end the violence. To accelerate this implementation, as I mentioned earlier, Budget 2023 has money specifically targeted for that, and it's thanks to your advocacy that it saw its way into the budget. On a directly related issue, I want to thank, in particular, Regional Chief Woodhouse once again for her efforts on the First Nations-led and designed $23 billion final settlement agreement to compensate harm by discriminatory underfunding for the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and those impacted by the federal government's narrow definition of Jordan's Principle. Thank you to all the chiefs and all of you in attendance for unanimously supporting the resolution on Tuesday morning. This compensation is a historic amount, but it's matched only and perhaps surpassed by the amount of harm experienced by First Nations children. Aucune somme d'argent ne peut être réparer les injustices commises, mais la façon dont cet accord a été conclu est un signe que nous pouvons travailler en collaboration et différemment, y compris le travail qui doit être fait pour s'assurer que le système de protection de l'enfance au Canada est réparé. We know that this broken system feeds directly in to missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, and without fixing that, we're not addressing the long term. We witnessed another historic day on Thursday last Thursday, as the Vatican repudiated the doctrine of discovery, a doctrine that is racist, that's been used for centuries by colonial governments to justify atrocities committed against your peoples. The rejection of this doctrine is an important moment for Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world. Tout comme l'accord de règlement conclu cette semaine, la répudiation de cette doctrine n'a eu lieu que grâce à la résiliation et l'action des groupes et des leaders autochtones qui réclamaient cette mesure depuis un certain temps. Nous savons qu'il s'agit d'un pas en avant et cela conduit à une conversation naturelle sur les prochaines étapes. Bien qu'il soit trop tôt pour dire exactement ce que la répudiation de la doctrine signifie pour l'avenir du Canada, l'avenir de vos terres, elle montre que les voix autochtones qui ont été ignorées pendant trop longtemps sont enfin entendues à l'international. The rejection of this doctrine does align with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is now law in Canada. It states that any doctrine that promotes the superiority of peoples on the basis of racial, religious, and cultural differences is legally invalid. This is just one of the many necessary steps in continuing the conversation on reconciliation and renewed relationships with Indigenous peoples. We do know and we do acknowledge that the effects are still felt today. L'adoption de la loi au Canada a constitué, oui, certes, une étape importante, un tournant majeur dans notre travail actuel visant à renouveler nos relations de nation en nation. Nous savons que les effets systémiques se font sentir aujourd'hui. In order to move forward, Minister Lametti spoke about this earlier. The draft action plan, which we know isn't perfect and far from it, needs and requires your input. It's why it was put out very recently as a starting point to address the priorities in respecting your rights. We know that it needs to be reshaped, it needs to be living and breathing, and it needs your input in order to be a better document. Our relationship will not be limited by the plan, and our work does need to continue to reflect your priorities as those priorities emerge and evolve. Last month, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples visited Canada to understand Indigenous rights implementation, gather good practices, and identify continuing obstacles. While he noted the progress in many areas, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, self-government negotiation tables, and the appointment of an Indigenous woman to the Office of Governor-General and the Supreme Court of Canada, he also pointed out many of the gaps that is a lived experience of your people today. Lack of housing, overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the welfare system, the ongoing crisis of MNWG, overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system, the negative impacts of resource extraction, and racism in healthcare. Au cours de sa visite, le rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies a également dénoncé les conséquences effroyables des pensionnats. La vérité doit présider la réconciliation et la voix des survivants doit au centre de notre travail. Alors que des communautés de tout le Canada annoncent des découvertes concernant des lieux de sépulture anonymes associés à d'anciens pensionnats, et quand on réfléchit aux prochaines étapes, ce travail est plus important que jamais. We acknowledge that trust must precede and truth must precede reconciliation, and we must keep survivors' voices in the front and center of our work. It's more important now than ever, as communities across Canada announce continuing findings on unmarked burial sites associated with former residential schools and consider the next steps. I'd also highlight that we're making headway on a number of governance issues essential to your determination, such as advancing the resolution of outstanding historical grievances. Some of the action plan I mentioned earlier speaks directly to this intention. The Action Plan Measure 23 calls on Canada to issue public statement on rights-based approach to replace the comprehensive land claims and inherent right policy as the federal starting point in negotiations. In many ways, we've moved beyond these policies in practice, but we know that a new public statement will provide the clarity required to ensure that your rights are implemented according to your self-determined priorities. In November, we launched a formal joint partnership between Canada and the AFN to reform the specific claims process, which is consistent with the principles of UNDRIP and creates an external regulation center that will accelerate the regulation of specific claims and reinforce confidence in the system. I want to thank the AFN and the Chiefs Committee on Land, Territories and Resources in particular on the substantive amount of work and engagement they've done on this front. This past fiscal year, 54 specific claims were resolved through negotiation with more than $3.3 billion in settlement with First Nations communities across your country. This is a historic amount at a historic pace, but that pace needs to get even faster. What has been lost in a sense in the last budget is my mandate to move even quicker on a number of claims across the country. And obviously, it's not a question of simply believing my word, but seeing it in practice. So I hope to be standing here next year with an even larger sum that has been resolved in the right way. I'd finalize my thoughts before we go to questions, because I do want to take the time to answer them properly. Is part of the reform of the additions to reserve process, which we launched very recently, but we know this despite the fact that 265,000 acres of lands of reserve have been added since 2015, representing 440 ATRs. This is way too slow. There are way too many that are outstanding, and the work that Minister Haidu and I need to do to repair that and move in a better way has not yielded the results that we need to see and that you need to see. And that's work that we need to continue doing together. But again, part of reforming that process means you're at the table, and that's work that will continue conceivably throughout the next year. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for allowing me the time to speak. And I leave myself to you for the questions and any comments on what I've just said. Miigwech. Thank you et merci.
Thank you very much for this presentation. So there's a hard stop at 3. So what I suggest is to take 3 at a time, and we'll see where we are after that. So I'm very, I want to say a big thank you for your comprehension, because we might not have time to go to all of you. So thank you very much for this. We'll take microphone number 1, and then microphone number 2, and then there's no one on the line. So we'll come back to you, to Chief Kopanache. You're the last on this first round. Thank you very much. On this, I'm going to ask you to please state your name, First Nation. 3 minutes. Microphone number 1, please.
Miigwech, Chair. George Kone couldn't go, Pijio do tem. Not Kamegwaning Anishinabe Treaty 3. Warren White, Council Proxy for Chief Cabestra. Good day, Minister Miller. I've spoken to you various times. And I reminded your minister yesterday, Lemedi, about the 150 years of Treaty 3. He was not aware. He didn't even know. He would remind you of our celebration and our acknowledgement to Treaty 3. I ask, what does Crown-Indigenous Minister means to you? I heard you could not, you didn't make a commitment to join us as a treaty partner. You did not commit to that date, October 3rd. I emphasize to you, Minister, you have to be there on your responsibility as the Crown-Indigenous Minister to honor the spirit and intent of our treaties that we have upheld and lived and exercised for 150 years. I ask you, commit to being there. We have to acknowledge and respect and honor the treaty. The nation to nation belongs to Treaty 3 and your government. Your new policies, or however you're going to approach it, I told Trudeau at the time when he came to us and committed to nation, we will help you. We will assist you what we mean about nation to nation. That was 2014. I still haven't seen it, as I was the Grand Chief Ogichita of Treaty 3. When is that going to happen? And you had more than 3 minutes to speak.
15 seconds.
When the treaty was made, we didn't have 3 minutes to speak. Treaty 3 was a reason why we held out. Treaty right to education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief. Microphone number 2, please state your name and First Nation. Up to 3 minutes to you.
Good afternoon. I want to acknowledge the beautiful unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. Also, I want to let you know my name is Heather Bear. I'm a Vice Chief, 4th Vice Chief for the FSIN. Mr. Minister, today we talked about the two racist and colonial doctrines, terra nullius, doctrine of discovery. These have allowed the Crown to unilaterally claim sovereignty over our peoples and our lands for far too long. There were millions of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island when the Crown illegally laid claim to these lands. These doctrines continue to oppress our nations, and it is how Canada and the provinces have continued to assert their assumed authority over our lands and resources. Now we know that the Saskatchewan First Act, Bill 88, has now passed 3rd reading, and it is the Crown's unlawful assertion of jurisdiction over resources that rightfully belong to First Nations. We see this bill as an immediate threat to our inherent treaty and constitutional rights, especially when the province says that they have exclusive jurisdiction over the natural resources within our treaty territories and lands. Mr. Minister, this is completely false. The treaties that we made nearly 150 years ago were meant to allow for settlement of the prairies, not to surrender the lands and resources. Our ancestors have continually said that we shared the land to the depth of a plow. We did not cede, release, or surrender our rights to the lands and resources. This sacredness of treaty is what is at stake today. The province continues to sell Crown lands and Crown minerals, leaving the First Nations out. Then First Nations have less land on which to assert our rights. Hunt, fish, trap, gather. And when we can't buy the lands and the mineral, and then we can't buy those lands or the minerals because they're sold off by the provinces at alarming rates.
30 seconds.
First Nations are working hard to maintain their way of life. Our land base is shrinking. Mr. Minister, we need to look at that NRTA. That needs to be amended. Thrown out the window. We need an amendment to our Constitution. And also, we need to get those long-standing specific claims that have been unsettled. We need to settle them within the next 14 months. Thank you.
Chimigwich. Microphone number 1, last speaker for this round of speakers. Chief Kopanachi, to you. Microphone number 1, please.
Buju, Mishgrab, Nindijnakas, Makwan, Dodem, Anishinaabe, and Dow. I too would like to acknowledge the unceded territories and also mention that the nations and communities of Treaty 3 also never ceded their lands nor waters. I also wanted to join our Ogijta Warren White in inviting the minister and hopefully to see a commit this October to coming to the 150th anniversary of Treaty Number 3. But my questions that I have, one of our elders, Douglas Cummigan, asked me to raise the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous boys and girls, Indigenous boys and men. I know that Elder Douglas is here as well, so I just want to take the time to acknowledge Elder Douglas from Treaty 3 here, and that is just as serious of an issue back home in terms of the issues that we're facing right now. Minister Miller, I've got a lot of respect for you. I've worked for this government, both as a political advisor and as a bureaucrat, and I can't speak for other First Nations, but I do worry that things are getting worse in our First Nation community under your government. We're in a state of emergency. I've mentioned a couple days ago that it feels like I'm watching the extinction of my people, death after death after death, and very little response from your government in terms of particularly our infrastructure needs, but the direct intervention on the ground in terms of that support that we need on the ground. I worry again that if we don't have some protections of our lands and waters and our territories, that if they do surround us with mines, just like they have done with some communities like Blueberry First Nation in British Columbia, that we too will be community-less, landless, waterless, and homeless in Kenora. So I urge you, Minister, I think my second question would be that, communities that are in states of emergencies like ours, that was actually governed by your government until 2017, it was co-managed. We don't have the ability to engage. It's hard for me to come to Treaty 3 meetings. It's hard for me to go to Chiefs of Ontario meetings because the reality is that we're burying so many of our community members right now. I'm grateful for the National Chief again to come to our community and inspire us, but we need a way for those communities that are at the very bottom to be able to engage, to be able to access the infrastructure dollars, to be able to access the program dollars. In a way that can actually lift our state of emergency so that we can build the capacity that someday we'll be able to be on a fair level playing field. But again, the Ojibways of Onegimang, I fear, is getting worse under your government, and I do look for any intervention that you can have with your colleagues to help lift our state of emergency once and for all, and give some hope to the future generations of the Ojibways of Onegimang. English Minister.
Miigwech, thank you very much. And this closes the speakers list because there's just a few minutes, two minutes left for Minister Miller to answers and closing. So thank you very much for your comprehension, and I will now turn the floor over to Minister Miller. To you.
Former Cook B. Wilson and Marlene Hale had a declaration that I'm glad to give a few minutes.
The thing is, you will be taking minutes from your colleague. I do, so you deal with her. So we'll take
rock and a hard place.
One last at microphone number 2, and then we'll come back to you, and we'll know where we are at this time. So microphone number 2, please, Judy Wilson.
Judy Wilson. I'm deferring my time to Marlene Hale from Wet'suwet'en Nation. Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak with the AFN. Skyse, Denise, Zakuze. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests, my name is Marlene Hale, and I'm from the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I reside in Montreal, where my work is on a regular webinar that I do with all the work that I do for Indigenous people, plus my own people of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. In regards to the last Thursday's announcement from the Vatican, my webinar was shown all across Canada and globally with the guest speaker of Ernie Daniels, who spoke on my webinar in regards to the Pope's decision. And also, he invited me here to the AFN. With this, I have come with a letter to His Majesty the King. And it'll be also to the Right Honourable Mary Simon and Honourable Justin Trudeau. I'll quickly read the letter. It's a petition to the Crown for a new royal proclamation. Dear Sir, wishing you an excellent coronation ceremony in May. We are writing to the Crown to issue a new royal proclamation. We are all Indigenous citizens hailing from the various sovereign Indigenous peoples and nations of Turtle Island, known as Canada. On March 30th, 2023, we welcomed the official repudiation of the doctrine of discovery by the Vatican. It was hopeful and a historical moment, a very important step in the history of Canada, where we have all embarked on a journey of reconciliation between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples of Canada. The Vatican's repudiation of this colonial concept is important to us in our quest to fully recognize our sovereignty, rights, and titles as original peoples from these lands. It contributes to opening a new era of a more dignified, just, and peaceful existence within Canada and echoes the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP recommendations. In 1996, the recap called for the significant change in the relationships that Canada holds with Indigenous peoples. I recommended that the sovereign issue a new royal proclamation. I'm ending it by saying, inspired by the Vatican's announcement and drawing on the recap recommendation, we welcomed you to the Sovereign and the King of Canada in the strong hope that you mark a positive difference in our history, that within Canada's adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Independence of People, and Canada's commitment to the truth and reconciliation. With great respect, Marlene Hale, and I have asked our National Chief, Roseanne Archibald, who will be there for the crowning, to deliver this letter. Masai, thank you. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you very much. So on that, the discussion period is over. I'm going to turn the floor over to Minister Miller for answers and conclusion. To you, Minister Miller. You can come to the podium if you prefer.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So just in the brief answer to Councillor White, I'll do my utmost best to be there on October 3rd. I know how important the 150th anniversary is. It's just a question of checking my schedule. So I'm committed to being there. I just want to be in a position where I can actually honor that promise and don't want to break it. So the only reason that I used that turn of phrase this morning was based on what I just told you. And absolutely, this is a relationship that needs to be respected. I think it leads me into some of the points that Vice Chief Bear made about the Sask First legislation, which, I think obviously we haven't seen the effect of it yet, but some of the terminology seems to misunderstand the relationship and the basis on which the province of Saskatchewan was built. There are at least 2 Supreme Court judgments that say that treaties must be respected by provinces. And to make such blanket statements in a piece of provincial legislation does have the potential of not only undermining your rights, but paving the path for others to undermine your rights. And I think we need to remind and constantly remind ourselves that treaties do sit above provincial legislation and the relationships that are constitutionally protected under Section 35. When it comes to issues like the critical mineral strategy and the work we need to do together as a country to make sure that we are respecting our environmental obligations for this generation and those to come, I think it needs to be clearer and clearer to Canadians or any company or person that wants to exploit the minerals and resources of Canada that you can't do that on the backs of Indigenous peoples. And the reality is that there is a pathway that's been paved not only by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, not only in treaty, but in consecutive Supreme Court judgments that have a path for industry to work together with communities that want to work together and make sure that there is a pathway towards consent. People also have to be able to take no as an answer when communities say no. And that far too often has been overlooked. If you're a private company in Canada looking to exploit resources and minerals on Indigenous territory, and your lawyers are telling you that you don't have to engage with Indigenous peoples, you should probably fire your lawyers, because there is, and the best companies are actually understanding this, that there is a pathway towards consent, but it involves making sure Indigenous peoples are at the table from the get-go, and not just a desktop operation that you do at the end because someone reminded you. That is a lesson that'll probably have to be painfully reminded to people, but if we're going to build an economy that is based on your lands, on the resources that we have through treaty or through other arrangements agreed to work together on, that lesson will have to be reminded to people time and time again. Those provincial acts are unhelpful and on the face of them appear to violate treaty obligations that provinces themselves are beholden to. And that's without talking about another painful issue, which is the Natural Resource Transfer Acts that exist that do have obligations for provinces to respect TLE, which hasn't occurred. And so there are laws on the books today that impose on provincial governments, setting aside Supreme Court judgments, that tell provinces that they do have to respect the provincial crown lands that are set aside for Indigenous peoples. And that's, I think, going to be a painful reminder, either through the courts, but hopefully in a proactive way through continued work on making sure that TLE is respected. And Canada has a role in that. We can't walk away from that role. Chief Kopanis, look, I think, and this is something that I see visiting communities, that perhaps in this dialogue, missing boys have been overlooked. I have seen evidence from communities looking for their lost boys, much to the same circumstances that the final report spoke about, as well as the role of men in making sure that women are safe in this, women and children and the gender diverse community are safe in this country. I think perhaps in the effort of trying to identify a very important issue that is critical to who you are as a people, we've overlooked the phenomenon of missing boys, and I think that is something that needs to be acknowledged. In fact, it's a discussion I had with Secretary Holland recently when we were talking about some of the cross-border work and the work we have to do together to make sure your peoples are respected on both sides of an imposed border to keep them safe and alive, and I thank you for contributing to that. And just on a last point, and I think I spoke mostly to it in my response to Vice Chief Bear, is the federal government does have a role to play in making sure your rights are respected, and the painful lesson of Blueberry River is in British Columbia. Is that if we don't respect it, the price tag will be very, very high for the federal government and the provincial government, with the ongoing effects that are felt today and all the Treaty 8 communities. In fact, a good number of the Treaty 8 communities in BC. So thank you for that, but it needs to be respected in your neck of the woods, and it's why we're working with the Minister of Natural Resources in particular, as well as with Minister Hyder, to make sure that there is a table where particularly when we're talking about the critical mineral strategy, should be seen as an opportunity and not another wave of fear over your communities. Thank you. Miigwech. And I acknowledge the speech by Marlene Hale, and thank you for that.
Merci beaucoup. Yes. Oh, you want to say? Okay.
Thank you very much, Minister Miller. And unfortunately, we always run out of time with ministers, but I ask the speakers to perhaps go to this side of the room to accompany the minister for any final comments or questions that you have for him as he exits on the left side. We have a gift for you, Minister. I always point out that in our gift, we always give out baby moccasins. These ones have little hearts on them. And we always want our partners, our federal partners, to remember our little ones, our families, and our communities in their work.